Once again, we're pleased to have you all in Amsterdam and for our conference on Muslim subjectivities. Our project, supported by ERC, by the European Research Commission, is already in its final phase, so we have another year to go. I'll talk more about the structure of the project and its goals, but we will see that there are many common themes that we have, and I'm looking forward to theoretical discussions in the coming 2 days, Friday and Saturday. So fortunately, there is this book that came out a few weeks ago, which is a nice pretext to start the conference, not just with the usual theoretical frameworks and some preliminary ideas of what to discuss, but rather just say what is already out there, since the book is available in open access and you can simply download it and read. So first of all, why Muslim subjectivity? Why this topic? Why this subject? Because as some of you might know, I'm a historian of Islam in Russia, and I've been doing research on manuscripts, and there are these debates on the history of legal schools and Sufism, so kind of more conservative and traditional topics that have been, well, quite popular since the fall of the Soviet Union and with the archival revolution of the 1990s, when all of these sources in Arabic, Persian, and Turkic languages suddenly became available for the international audience. And again, these, we witnessed, at least before the Russian invasion in Ukraine, we witnessed this spectacular rise of international interest in the history and contemporary situation with Muslim cultures in the former Soviet lands. And when composing this ERC project, we came forward with a few ideas why studying Muslim subjectivity. So first of all, we wanted to really focus on the life narratives of Russian Muslims. So not letting them speak for themselves and understand really the complexities of individual self-expression and the hybrid ways how multiple individuals at different periods of time during the imperial era as well as during the Soviet times try to use multiple cultural elements that were available to them, like languages, scripts, even technical elements, be that photograph or the more traditional Muslim book culture or Soviet literacy. So we try to look at this plethora of cultural variations and elements in order to see how Muslims represented themselves. And that is that was, for me personally, a way to move from the post-colonial framework that I had when writing my dissertation, because I wrote something on the history of Soviet Oriental studies in Central Asia and in Kazakhstan. That was a description of the history, how Soviet Orientalism functioned in Central Asia. And with this project, we as a team are trying to see what is it that Muslims are saying for themselves. So shifting the focus and shifting the attention from representation towards more of a direct speech of Muslims in Russia. So when we started to approach this big topic, we quickly realized that archival practices and building of private archives was of crucial importance in our work, like from the very beginning. Because where is it that we should look for in order to dig out or just try to imagine the ways how Muslim individuals describe themselves and put together these fragments of themselves and established strategies and tactics of how to sell themselves in the respective societies. So oftentimes the question is that we have to go to multiple private archives that are still there in Turkey, in the Russian Federation, in Finland, in Central Asia, and we did a lot of travel and really work with those who keep these precious archives of sometimes prominent individuals of the previous era, or not that prominent, those who simply wrote something on their lives and their experience during the imperial or Soviet era, or those who possessed sometimes huge photographic archives at their homes and also have something to say about the history of how those archives came into existence, how they developed during the 20th century, and how the individual selves were constructed through these archival practices. So that was one of the, well, maybe it sounds obvious now, but for us it was a small discovery that we made for ourselves, that we really have to look at the level of archival production on this level of private, individual, family histories and voices that archival holders also have, the stories that they possess. Right, and another thing, and I'll already kind of mention it when saying about the post-colonial roots of this project. Actually, I see our venture into Muslim subjectivities in Russia as a decolonial project, because by focusing on the individual self-fashioning, we are trying to go beyond the imposed colonial classifications, the national classifications being probably the most significant ones. So trying to think differently about the space of Islam in Russia, not just in terms of ethno-nationalism and the Soviet national identities oftentimes imposed on these populations, is also the way to discover multiple decolonial histories and multiple decolonial scenarios that are possible for this part of the world. So, and our book that is here is a modest step into this direction. Well, a few words about our team. Most of them are here in this room. So Shamil Shekhaliyev is our postdoc with lots of experience working on the history of, now you have to expect a long list of subjects. The history of Sufism, Islamic law, private and state collections in Dagestan and beyond. So everything related to Arabic literature in the North Caucasus. Shamil is our great specialist. And he is now finishing his masterpiece, a huge monograph on the founding father of Arabic studies in Dagestan, Muhammad Said Saidov. And Shamil will talk more about his project, but I'm really looking forward to the publication of his book, because I believe it will change many of our perceptions of the trajectories of how Islamic cultures developed in this part of the world. So Galia Muratova is our PhD student, and she is really one of the organizers of this conference, and we are really grateful for your efforts of making all this possible. Galia is working on her dissertation on Muslim visuality in the Soviet Union, in particular working with several quite impressive big archives of photography in private hands in St. Petersburg, but also in some peripheral localities of European Russia. Mansour Gazimzyanov is finishing his dissertation now on autobiographies of Muslims written sometime between late 19th century and 1960s, 1970s, with this long array of Muslim individuals experimenting with this genre of autobiography and writing themselves in this form. Michael Kemper is also part of our team, but he's not there. He's not here, unfortunately. He got ill, so we can only wish him health and say Dawamallahu umrahu and something like that. And myself, so I'm also working on a monograph right now, scrutinizing the history of state holdings of Islamic manuscripts in Russia. So before, as I said, I invested heavily in the understanding of the importance of private archives, and now I focus on the way how the state collections in Kazan and in St. Petersburg came into being in the course of the 20th century. There are so many things that I can tell you about, and one of the main conclusions is, there are two main conclusions that I can share with you now, is that my attempts to go beyond and criticize the paradigm of Islamic modernism doesn't really work, because now I see that all the people who collected the manuscripts throughout the 20th century are the Muslim modernists and Jadids. So that's the irony. Yes, I saw your reaction. And another thing is that these archives, the state archives in St. Petersburg and in Kazan, are so heavily populated by multiple discourses and individual agendas in collection effort that it's impossible to really do anything with these materials without being aware of their history. Like picking up some sources here and there doesn't really work, because if we do not understand what stands behind, what was the driving force of these sources going into this direction, and just why do we have these collections in the way we have them, and what are the limits of our knowledge when we approach them. So these are kind of the questions that also deal pretty much with Muslim subjectivity, because who was collecting these objects? Well, Muslim individuals, Muslim reformists who also had their own vision on history and archive building, and they left their deep imprint on the archival landscape of Islam in Russia. Well, but that's something that you will hopefully see coming out in a year or so, hopefully, inshallah. So the conceptual frame that we suggest in our project, and I really hope that this will be something that we will discuss during the conference, and I guess some of the papers from our team also refer to this pyramid that you see in my presentation. So basically, this is a kind of methodology that we suggest in studying Muslim subjectivity with the case study in Russia. And it might be also helpful for your cases, and I'm curious to hear your opinion and maybe attempts to implement it somehow. So first of all, we start with this highest level of abstraction and the cultural repertoire that kind of unites all possible forms of cultural production that were potentially available to Muslim individuals at a certain period of time for their self-fashioning. They could refer to it somehow if these elements of cultural production were intelligible to them and somehow available to them in a material form. Then on the next level, we have another abstract idea of models, of what is perceived as a desired form of self-fashioning. Shamil will deliver a lecture on this particular topic with examples of how that works in Dagestan, with this changing models of an ideal Muslim individuality, right? When it was generally agreed in the society that it's great to be a Sufi of particular sort, then after a century or so, there is another idea of more of a legalist approach, and Sufism becomes more marginal, and things like that, right? So these models are changing over time, and in principle, some of those models constitutes cultural repertoire more globally. Then we try to use and adopt a concept from literary studies, the concept of persona or mask that individuals develop in their attempt to construct a personified vision of the self. And I guess, well, I'll be talking about that with an example from the book. And the self, actually the situation on the ground, let's call it that way. So the complex, hybrid, and very fragmented understanding of the individual. So all the kind of messy reality that is going on at the moment, and the individual trying to make sense out of it. And actually making sense of it is going on the level of persona. So we often see with the private archives that these archives are the mirrors of the persona that individuals wanted to construct. Or sometimes these are not even personal archives, but that can be even a manuscript. Recently with Shami Shekhalif, we have written an article on a collection of ijazas, those certificates of spiritual descent, that also were used in order to compose and construct a desired image of an individual, which is also, like, we call these cases persona building, right? So this is more or less, well, again, it might look a bit raw and simplistic, but it works in a sense that when you apply this framework on the archival situation, that helps in classification and, in writing the history of Muslim subjectivities. So I just wanted to put this map in my presentation in order to give you a sense of where we are. So Orenburg, the city of Orenburg is in the center, and I'll be speaking about this territory of South Urals, so between Ufa, Chelyabinsk, and southwards, and the western parts of what is today Kazakhstan. So this multi-ethnic and multilingual region of the late imperial and early Soviet era is the time and space that will interest us today. In my talk about Abdulmajid al-Qadri and his memoirs that he wrote in Soviet times. So he was born in one of the Kazakh settlements of this western parts of present-day Kazakhstan. But most of his youth he spent in Isterlibash, which was a village in southern Urals, famous for its Naqshbandiya, Mujaddidiya, Sufi brotherhoods, and it was like a widely known regional center for Sufism in the 19th century. Interestingly, in the memoirs of al-Qadri, you don't see much of the Sufi influence, which also tells us something about the change in models, right, that took place in the 20th century. And he really also left some reflections on that, why he didn't want to be a Sufi himself and what was his positioning towards the Sufi legacy at that particular place. So he also spent a few years in Medina to be a Quran specialist. And what is also kind of significant about his life narrative is that he described himself and his path through the verses of the Quran. And I call it performance of the book, like the embodiment and the embodiment of the Quranic verses, because it's interesting to see how someone with deep investment in learning and memorizing the Quran then uses the book, kind of the standard text of the Quran, in order to explain and describe his life experiences. So basically, this is what Al-Qadri's memoirs are about. So he did that. He on many occasions simply said, well, this is what happened to me, and it's all in accordance with the verses from the Quran, this and that. Tragically, Al-Qadri spends 15 years in Gulag, so 5 years in Salavki in the north, and 10 years of prison near Tashkent in the south. So his life story is a combination of his description of this very rich Muslim culture in late imperial times, and then its crumbling and also prison experience during the 1920s and in the 1930s. So we get both in the same narrative. So these memoirs, they exist in a single manuscript, so there is no other copy, written in the Arabic script Tatar. And from the manuscript, we can guess that it was written in Orenburg sometime in 1955, 1956. What is interesting is that even though, as you can see from this picture, Al-Qadri was fine with being photographed, and there are at least some photographs in his family archives. In his family archive, there is no single photograph inside of the manuscript. So he kind of consciously, I would suppose, made a decision to write about himself in this more conservative way and using the environment, the intellectual environment of traditional Muslim book culture, rather than experimenting with it and putting their photographs and making it more like more of a Soviet-style autobiography or something like that. Or maybe just writing it in Russian, right? But he preferred something that was more familiar to him from the times when he was happy, when he was traveling in the Near East, when he was learning the Quran, and when he was what he wanted to be, when he was the Quran reciter, right? So this manuscript is still preserved in the family archive by his granddaughter, Zuhra Valiulova. And this fact also tells us something about the nature of the archival landscape in Russia. So where do you go in order to learn about the history of Islam or Muslim individuals? So there is no archive which is called the Archive of Muslims in Russia, right? You have to really go and look for individual stories. You have to discover narratives such as Al-Qadri's memoirs. And this is also quite interesting to know that even though Al-Qadri was consciously collecting books, and obviously throughout his life he was building a private archive, he is writing about that in his memoirs, there is no private archive of Al-Qadri in existence. Basically, there are no traces except for one book of his memoirs, which is a kind of interesting contradiction, right? So usually we work with, private archives with lots of material, photographs, libraries and all of that. Well, Matteo still remembers the pain in the neck scanning all the manuscripts and books in the library of Abbas Bibarsov in Penza region. Thousands of items stored there. But here, even though we know that there was this effort in archive building, nothing has survived except for only this book that was of emotional value for the relatives. That's why it's there, right? And I'm saying and emphasizing this part especially because it is not only the kind of the presence that interests us, but also the absences, right? Things that did not survive, and then we can question, there are several things that we can question. First of all, we can question the representativeness of those archives that have survived and how far this is really kind of situation that was going on out there, if many other things simply didn't survive. And another thing is that what is it that didn't make it to our day? Can we sort of analyze and speculate about the reasons why this or that item simply didn't make it? So further, a bit of critique of myself, like, yes, again, Bustanov is talking about manuscripts. Why not something else, like going beyond these textual focused discourses? It's all about male subjectivities. Again, no women, only all these guys who are doing history. And finally, it's more or less focused on scholarly circles. So is it about ulama subjectivity, really like the highest class of intellectuals that we're talking about? Well, I have this but here on my slide. What is good about Al-Qadri's memoirs is that there is a lot of material that we can compare with the memoirs of Al-Qadri. First of all, his kids, his children, they were eager to write about themselves in Russian, and they also produced lots of photographs. And then that kind of gives us the material to compare their sense of subjectivity with Al-Qadri's, right? That is one. And another that Al-Qadri's manuscript covers both the late and imperial and Soviet era. What is good is also that in his manuscript we see a plethora of identities described before the Soviet national delimitation. So basically what I want to say here is that his sense of being a Muslim Tatar from central Russia was different, radically different from the national projects of Soviet era. And in that sense, similar autobiographical sources, they again provide material for decolonial thinking about the way how the national map and the national identities they were kind of constructed in the 20th century. The memoirs are also rich for creative language use, so it's not only Arabic script Tatar, but also lots of Russian, also criminal jargon that is present there, because 15 years in prison do not pass without nothing, right? Arabic is there, Ottoman, Uzbek, and Kazakh, so you see this play with the languages in a creative way going on there. And actually, what is good about Al-Qadri is that he was not really a scholar, and he doesn't write about himself as a scholar. His direct speech is more like a friendly story about his life that he wanted to reveal to his readers and relatives. And the most important thing is that Al-Qadri dreamed of being a professional reciter of the Quran, and not some ulama, imam, or some intellectual writing books. So what is it really that you can find in the book, and why you might be interested to read it? Well, what fascinated me most when I was translating it and doing research in it is that it's full of emotions. So the history of emotions is not that of kind of really developed topic, at least in our area studies of Islam in Russia and Eurasia, but there is so much stuff and very developed vocabulary when Al-Qadri writes about friendship, about death, and his experiences during the Great Terror. So, well, one of the reviewers of my book told me that, well, you have this long introduction about Muslim subjectivities, but actually what comes next, the actual body of your source translation, is about the social history of these populations in Central Eurasia. So I also keep that. I was not really focusing on the social aspects, the social history in there, but again, social history of the non-Slavic population of the empire also richly populates the narrative in the book. There is lots of stuff on mobility, and you can read this book as a travelogue describing Al-Qadri's travels in the Ottoman Empire, the Russian North, and Central Asia. Sometimes this is examples of forced mobility because he was imprisoned and had to move here and there, or when he was simply said, well, you can come back to your home, but just go. And he travels from the north to his home village, just almost not knowing what's the way and how to get there. And what I also like about these memoirs is that it opens a window into the world of intersubjective relations and multiple forms of self-fashioning, so that Al-Qadri doesn't only write about himself, but also reveals dialogues, and he writes about the way how others portrayed themselves when they encounter each other. So in that sense, Al-Qadri's memoirs, whatever its textual limitations are, and maybe conceptual limitations, still it's a wonderful source that we can use as a starting point for discussions on Muslim subjectivity or Muslim subjectivities in plural, on the role of language use and the way how colonial forms of identity building also engage with the first-person narratives and ego documents that Muslims of Russia produced in large quantities. So here I stop my presentation, and if you are interested for more stuff, you can visit our website, mindarchives.com, where we publish some of our archival findings. And we also have a recently opened YouTube channel with some of the videos from the field that you can see and also kind of feel the atmosphere of life out there of Muslim cultures in Central Eurasia. Thank you for your attention. I think at this point we stop recording, and we can exchange ideas about this book or just talk about Muslim subjectivities in any format that you like. Thank you.